The cutting-edge jet engine, worth millions, sat dead silent under the hangar sun, choked by a persistent red error light. CEO Clara Vance stormed in, glacial and sharp with disdain. Highly paid engineers argued, deadlocked. In the shop's far corner, Ethan Miller, the single dad mechanic, silently watched, his hands oily. Clara fixed her gaze on him and laughed. "Let the professionals handle this, Miller." Ethan sighed, pulling his greasy sleeve up past his elbow. A distinct, complex, faded tattoo was revealed on his forearm. Clara Vance instantly froze, her scornful smile shattering. The hangar went deathly still. Ethan Miller was the indispensable, yet forgotten, cog in the high-tech aviation machine. He handled the dirty, granular work the white-collar engineers preferred to theorize about. He was a single father, his life neatly segmented into two non-negotiable priorities: ensuring the continued, flawless operation of the hangar's multi-million-dollar fleet, and being home in time to help his 10-year-old daughter Lily with her homework and prepare her favorite tuna casserole. His current title, Line Maintenance Technician 3, sounded official but meant he was the last line of defense, meticulously changing filters, cleaning carbon deposits, and ensuring every fastener met the unforgiving torque specifications. His professional territory was firmly beneath the machines, in the engine nacelles, within the wheel wells, and deep inside the cramped, hot auxiliary units. He was an observer, not a participant, in the grand strategy, avoiding design reviews and budget meetings, keeping his distance from high-level decision-making. He was quiet by nature, avoiding conflict and keeping the details of his past strictly private. Ethan understood the corporate landscape. A low profile was the only guarantee of stability for his family life at a multinational aerospace giant. He was, ironically, the most indispensable person on the floor, yet simultaneously the easiest to overlook. Clara Vance, the CEO, was the aggressive, polished force at the apex of the company, driven by aggressive restructuring and an unshakable belief in what she termed data-driven meritocracy. This meritocracy was rigidly defined by academic credentials, financial performance, and a willingness to be ruthless. Clara was decisive, brilliant, and accustomed to managing public crises under intense pressure. But her leadership style was predicated on the notion that ability was directly correlated with rank. Rank, in her view, was undeniably purchased with expensive degrees, elite training, and capital. The men in greasy coveralls like Ethan were merely the essential, low-cost labor necessary for operation, but never the solution to a critical engineering problem. The current crisis was the VTX-1, their flagship next-generation turbofan engine, which was supposed to secure a lucrative, multi-billion-dollar government contract. It had failed its final, crucial pre-delivery stress test. The error was not simple, it was insidious. A rare, highly specific combustion instability that manifested only after prolonged periods of high-stress operation, precisely when the machine was supposed to be performing flawlessly. The highly sophisticated electronic diagnostic systems were completely overwhelmed, spitting out conflicting, unusable error codes. The high-level engineering team, 3 thermodynamics PhDs and 2 metallurgy specialists, were locked in a stalemate, their theoretical arguments dissolving into desperate finger-pointing. Every passing hour put Clara's meticulously crafted reputation and the company's future profits at risk. Clara, her legendary patience shredded down to nothing, needed a visible win, or at least a convenient target for her public frustration. Her gaze, hot with fury, landed on Ethan. She summoned him forward purely as a piece of dismissive, cruel theater. "You, Miller! You're standing there like you have a better idea than $5 million worth of engineering degrees," she scoffed, her voice echoing cruelly off the hangar walls. "Go ahead, enlighten us, the actual experts. Tell us what the problem is. Did you forget to clean the oil filter, perhaps? Did you mistake a torque wrench for a spoon?" The engineers immediately looked down, shuffling their feet. They feared Clara much more than they respected Ethan, and none were willing to interrupt her outburst. Ethan stepped out of the shadows, wiping his hands slowly on a rag. He didn't engage in the verbal confrontation. He took one step closer to the massive, inert engine, his approach purely observational. He wasn't relying on data sheets, computer models, or the theoretical knowledge taught in classrooms. His analysis began with a unique, profoundly ingrained skill. Unlike the engineers who started with a diagnostic printout, Ethan always started by simply listening. In his hands, a simple, non-conductive metal rod became an extension of his ear, a makeshift stethoscope pressed against the engine casing. It was a saying among the mechanics. Ethan could hear the metal groaning before the sensors were even authorized to report the data. He stood there for a long minute, head tilted slightly, listening intently to the subtle residual sounds of the cooling engine. He registered the unique sigh of the intake manifold, the slow, uneven tick of contracting metal deep within the auxiliary power unit. These sounds, which were mere background noise to the coding-focused engineers, told Ethan a clear story of kinetic stress and thermal strain. Ethan finally looked up, his eyes direct and unflinching, conveying a competence that transcended language. "The engine is struggling with the ingestion cycle, Miss Vance. It's running too lean on the high end. It's not an electrical failure, but a kinetic one induced by heat." Clara burst into harsh, condescending laughter. "A lean cycle? Miller, that's what our computer models determined 3 hours ago. The issue is the source. You've delivered an observation suitable for a high school vocational exam. Now stand down. You are actively distracting the actual professionals from their work." His quiet, grounded competence was instantly misinterpreted by the CEO as simple, low-grade incompetence. In her world, no one believed he possessed the necessary skill set to contribute beyond his minimal pay grade. Clara's mockery of Ethan only intensified. For the next hour, as the engineering team prepared for a high-risk restart, Clara systematically used Ethan as a humiliating punching bag, a convenient prop to elevate the perceived competence of her degreed staff and her own leadership. "Do you see how complex the fuel flow parameters are, Miller?" she challenged, pointing to a diagnostic screen displaying millions of algorithmic variables. "This is the fundamental difference between a man who simply turns a wrench and a man who designs a machine. You deal with the effect. We must deal with the cause. Your job is reactive, ours is predictive. You are the past, we are the future." The engineers, despite their discomfort, remained silent. Many of them knew Ethan was a phenomenal technician, perhaps the best in the hangar, but they relied too heavily on Clara's funding in favor to risk interrupting her tyrannical performance. Their collective silence was a quiet, suffocating validation of her humiliating rhetoric, a complicity that weighed heavily on Ethan's already weary shoulders. Meanwhile, the VTX-1 engine crisis deepened exponentially. During the next 2 attempted restarts, the critical exhaust gas temperature, EGT, spiked alarmingly, soaring past the maximum safe operating thresholds. Each failure visibly chewed away at the engine's integrity, evidenced by microfractures and deepening mechanical instability, increasing the risk of a catastrophic engine blowout. The contract deadline was now hours away, and the client, a high-ranking military official, was due to arrive at dawn. Frustration twisting her face into a snarl, Clara slammed her palm down hard on the control panel. "We are out of time. We must test under load immediately. Run the core up to 90% thrust. Dr. Allister, override the EGT governor. We need hard, verifiable data, not this pathetic, theoretical whining." Her chief engineer, Dr. Allister, usually a picture of academic confidence, was now pale and trembling. He stammered a frantic warning. "Madam, overriding the EGT at 90% thrust is an extreme risk. It could lead to premature blade creep, irreparable damage to the high-pressure turbine stage, and potentially an explosion. We strongly advise against this protocol." "And I strongly advise against losing a billion-dollar contract, Doctor," Clara snarled, her eyes blazing with reckless desperation. "The risk is mine. Execute the command, now!" As the engine slowly spooled up, it began to emit a high-pitched, increasingly shrill metallic whine that grew rapidly louder. Ethan, standing beside a secondary diagnostic screen, saw the danger escalating far faster than the primary systems reported. His gaze was fixed not on the numerical data, but on a secondary acoustic feedback trace, a simple raw sound wave monitor, often neglected by the engineers. "Stop the test. Shut it down," Ethan commanded, his voice suddenly cutting across the rapidly increasing volume of the engine. Quieter than the turbine, yet somehow possessing a higher authority than the CEO's desperate orders. Clara, fixated on the flashing metrics, didn't even turn around. "I told you, do not interrupt me, Miller. Get back to your grease gun before I have you permanently banned from this facility." "That's sound," Ethan insisted, pointing to the sound wave that had momentarily spiked, creating a sharp, irregular peak, a dissonant frequency. "That is a critical flutter in the intake's static airfoil. It means the engine is attempting to pull air through a partially blocked intake throat, likely due to a heat-induced thermal expansion lock in the seventh stage." Dr. Allister scoffed loudly, desperate to reclaim favor with Clara. "A flutter? That is ambient noise, Miller. We are dealing with complex, non-linear thermodynamics in advanced material science, not a broken radio. Our intake pressure sensors clearly show all parameters are within acceptable tolerances." Clara finally turned, her face a mask of patronizing fury, the sheer arrogance palpable. "You see, Miller? The pure, unadulterated arrogance of the uneducated. You genuinely believe you can diagnose a million-variable, complex thermodynamic problem based on a random sound? You are officially dismissed, fully. Go home, collect your final check, and learn to respect your betters." The VTX-1 was screaming now, accelerating toward the self-destructive 90% thrust mark. Just as the turbine reached peak rotational velocity, the engine emitted a horrifying, distinct thump, a brutal sound of metal violently impacting internal components that shouldn't touch. The entire engine casing shuddered visibly. Immediately following, the EGT flashed solid red, skyrocketing far past the safe threshold. The emergency shutdown sequence engaged, but the damage was undeniable. The multi-million-dollar prototype was ruined, and the entire team was paralyzed by their costly, near-catastrophic failure, induced by the CEO's recklessness. Ethan didn't wait for permission or follow his dismissal orders. He walked determinedly, silently toward the control station. His face was set in grim resolution. He had to analyze the damage and, if possible, prevent a total loss before the CEO's recklessness led to a complete meltdown. Clara, momentarily stunned into silence by the engine's near destruction and the financial devastation it represented, whirled around just as Ethan reached the critical manual override console. Her voice, when it returned, was a high-pitched shriek of command. "How dare you? I explicitly fired you. Security, escort this incompetent man out immediately." Ethan ignored her, his concentration absolute as he reached for the manual bypass panel, a series of antiquated physical switches deliberately kept separate from the digital system. To gain the necessary leverage and access the tightly spaced switches in the cramped console, he pulled his oil-stained coverall sleeve high up his right arm, above the elbow. Twist 1. The tattoo. As the sleeve rode up, a section of skin that had been hidden for years of low-profile work was instantly revealed. It was covered by a single, intricate, and instantly recognizable tattoo. This was no common art. It was an elaborate, highly technical military emblem, a stylized black eagle gripping a complex, multi-bladed turbine, all enclosed within a sharp, six-sided polygon. This was the precise, non-standard insignia of the U.S. Air Force's 308th Special Operations Maintenance Wing, SOMW, a unit legendary and near mythical in the aerospace industry, dedicated to fixing high-risk tactical reconnaissance aircraft in volatile combat zones. The level of detail in the ink was immaculate, and the faded, scarred quality indicated a long, brutal history of active field service. Clara Vance stopped shouting instantly. The furious torrent of commands caught in her throat, and she inhaled sharply, the sound audible across the silent hangar floor. Her desperate, furious eyes, which had been fixed on Ethan's hands, snapped up to the insignia, then back down, tracing the lines of the polygon as if reading a language she desperately wished she had forgotten. "Stop," she whispered, her voice suddenly thin, reedy, and completely devoid of all corporate command authority. "Everyone, stop the immediate cleanup. Dr. Alistair, cancel the security call. Just stand down." No one in the hangar, not the engineers nor the younger mechanics, understood the true meaning of the tattoo. To them, it was just a striking piece of military art. But Clara knew. She knew because the 308th S-12W was not just any military unit. It was the unit responsible for the rapid on-site repair and deployment of her company's first high-speed aerial platform, the VTX-0 prototype, which nearly 8 years ago had suffered a catastrophic, unexplained mid-air systems failure during an unscheduled demonstration flight in the middle of a war zone exercise. Clara, then a rising, ruthlessly ambitious executive, had been on board the flight, having demanded to fly to impress a potential client. A single critical non-standard maintenance check, performed by a technician who recognized an acoustic signature that had been missed by every conventional sensor, had saved the platform, the client, and everyone on it, including Clara Vance herself. She remembered the unit's non-standard insignia and the haunting story of their lead tech, the ghost tech, a genius who never used a diagnostic computer. She had commissioned a discreet internal report years ago, trying to identify the technician who saved the jet, only to find the records classified and the man disappeared after his tour. Clara swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry as ash. She looked at Ethan, no longer seeing a disposable grease monkey, but a living ghost from a past life, a professional legend whose expertise had once saved her skin, and whom she had just publicly, savagely flayed. The shame was a cold, nauseating weight in her stomach. Twist 2, the hidden competence. "What is the problem, Miller?" Clara asked again, but this time, the tone was a quiet, desperate plea for true expertise, a surrender to a higher authority. "The problem is the thermal lock in the static airfoil," Ethan repeated, his voice calm, cutting through the chaos. "It's expanding too much under operational heat, causing an intermittent flow restriction, a mechanical choke. That flutter I heard earlier wasn't noise. It was the engine's frantic attempt to compensate for restricted airflow before the thermal threshold was breached. The heat locked the foil, causing a sudden, near-total reduction in mass airflow during the intake cycle." He pointed at the console's primary metrics, the data the PhDs had relied upon. "See here? The intake temperature is within parameters, but the compression ratio at the 7th stage is fractionally low, a difference of 0.4 psi, considered negligible by the algorithm. But after hours of operation, that minute difference causes the engine control unit to continuously overlean the fuel mixture, because the ECU thinks it has more air flowing through the combustion chamber than it actually does. We were chasing a fuel flow issue when the real problem was a mechanical, heat-induced choke on the air." Dr. Alistair, completely bewildered, immediately pulled the raw sensor data. But the system integrity checks show no physical obstruction, no foreign object damage, nothing that would account for a choke. "Because the pressure sensors are mounted too far down the line on the 9th stage," Ethan explained, his movements now rapid and precise. "The pressure successfully drops out after the constriction point on the 7th stage, so the sensor reads fine. It's an original, catastrophic design flaw in the sensor placement, but the metal tells you the truth through acoustics." He looked at Clara. "We can verify my theory." Ethan walked straight to the enormous engine, ignoring the stunned chief engineer and the CEO. He reached into his toolbox and grabbed a precise, specialized calibration tool. He located a small, undocumented access point near the 7th compressor stage, a point only an expert mechanic with deep field experience would know existed, and began a series of incredibly small, manual adjustments to the static airfoil, tensioning screws. Each turn was fractional, measured purely by feel and internal knowledge, not by any gauge. He looked less like a mechanic and more like a maestro performing delicate, critical surgery. Clara watched, captivated and humbled, The terror of losing the contract completely replaced by the profound, shocking awe of witnessing true, battle-tested mastery. After 2 minutes of precise manual work, Ethan stepped back, his face serene. Test the cycle. Low power, stabilized burn. Clara, unable to speak a formal command, simply nodded toward Dr. Allister, who nervously initiated a controlled low-power run. The engine spooled up. The sound was immediately cleaner, the whining smoother, and the underlying metallic groan was absent. The acoustic monitor showed a perfectly regular, harmonious sound wave. The EGT remained stable, precisely where it should be. They pushed the engine harder, this time without overriding any safety systems. The turbine spun up to 90% thrust and held the peak, smooth and powerful. The data confirmed it. The compression ratio was now perfect, the fuel mixture normalized, and the instability completely gone. The VTX-1 engine ran flawlessly. The entire hangar was dead silent, staring at the man whose hands were covered in yesterday's grease, but who had just delivered the company from ruin. The silence that followed stretched into a long, profound moment of corporate and personal reckoning. Dr. Allister and the senior engineering team rushed forward, frantically reviewing the new, flawless operational data. Their faces, initially contorted by disbelief and denial, slowly smoothed out into expressions of grudging, then absolute professional acceptance. The empirical analysis was undeniable. Ethan's non-standard, acoustic-based manual repair had bypassed a fundamental, potentially catastrophic software and sensor design flaw that the entire theoretical team had completely missed. Clara dismissed the engineers with a curt, barely audible wave. Her gaze locked onto Ethan. She motioned him toward a secluded, glass-walled observation office near the hangar floor, away from the immediate buzzing eyes of the remaining staff. This was no longer a public confrontation. It was a devastatingly private reckoning. Inside the quiet office, Clara leaned against the window, watching the enormous VTX-1 engine, now humming smoothly and powerfully, a tangible monument to Ethan's expertise. "The 308th, she finally stated, her voice flat, stripped of its usual razor-sharp edge. "That was your unit. I finally remember that insignia. And I remember the flight 8 years ago, the VTX-0 prototype that almost disintegrated over the Nevada desert." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his for confirmation. Ethan met her gaze, his posture relaxed, his hands still loosely clasped and stained with oil. He had anticipated this moment from the second she froze by the console. "It was a different life, Miss Vance. A different job. I much prefer this one. Predictable hours. Closer to home." He offered no details of heroism, no self-aggrandizement, and no boastful war stories. Clara felt a profound wave of icy, paralyzing shame wash over her. She had just spent an hour publicly, cruelly humiliating a man whose tactical acuity and raw, deeply intuitive skill had directly contributed to saving her professional future. And, she realized with sickening clarity, had likely saved her life, and the lives of the test pilots who risked everything. She finally grasped the full, horrifying extent of her arrogance. She hadn't simply mocked a mechanic. She had mocked the very principle of silent, operational excellence in real-world experience upon which her entire successful company was ultimately built. "You didn't rely on the models. You heard the sound, not the data," Clara said, shaking her head slowly, a genuine, powerful hint of awe entering her voice for the first time. "You were right from the very start. We nearly destroyed the VTX-1 and ruined our entire contract because we were too fixated on our theoretical models and the prestige of our degrees to listen to the machine itself. We failed to listen to the man who knows the machine better than its creators." The atmosphere in the hangar, outside the seclusion of the office, had already undergone a radical change. The line mechanics, who had witnessed Ethan's quiet, decisive triumph, now worked with a new, subtle, unshakable confidence. The high-level engineers, profoundly humbled by their massive system-wide oversight, were already beginning to approach the line crew, meekly asking for input on non-sensor data and mechanical tolerances. The shift wasn't loud or disruptive, but it was absolute. Clara realized the toxic culture of public shaming and rigid professional hierarchy she had carefully cultivated was now fundamentally broken, replaced by an uneasy but profoundly necessary respect for practical skill. The financial authority of the CEO was still intact, but the moral and operational power had decisively and permanently shifted to the man with the oil-stained hands. The next morning, Clara called Ethan back to the main boardroom, an intimidating space of glass and steel where he had never belonged. She skipped all pretense of corporate politeness. "I was completely wrong, Miller. Not just about the engine, but about competence itself," she stated, her voice firm with genuine contrition. The assumption that the dirtiest, lowest-ranking job belonged to the least skilled person nearly cost this company its entire future. She pushed a thick, gold-embossed folder across the polished mahogany table. "I'm offering you the newly created position of Chief Operational Integrity Officer. That comes with a seven-figure salary, a guaranteed permanent seat on the executive board, and unrestricted resources. No grease, no late nights in the hangar, just pure high-level oversight and strategy." Ethan didn't even touch the file. He gently pushed it back across the table, his eyes calm and unwavering. "I deeply appreciate the recognition, Miss Vance, but I must decline the title and the executive board seat. I need to be the single dad who fixes things with his hands, not the executive who attends meetings. My daughter Lily needs the stability of a father who is home every night, not the prestige of a man who travels the world for board meetings. I won't trade her peace for power." He looked at her, then stated his demand, his voice cutting and professional. "I will accept the salary increase in the full benefits package, but I will remain on the hangar floor, exactly where I can hear the engines. My new job is not to manage people, but to protect the technology. I require one contractual clause, the emergency override veto, EOV." Clara raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Explain the veto." "It's simple and non-negotiable," Ethan said, folding his hands. "If I or any certified line maintenance technician working the floor detects a kinetic or acoustic anomaly that suggests an imminent catastrophic failure, we have the unilateral, absolute power to halt any testing, any shipment, or any system rollout, without consulting the engineering team, your office, or any executive. This power comes with zero fear of reprisal. I need the institutionalized power to stop the machine the instant it cries out, and the assurance that my voice, and the voices of my crew, will be heard over the spreadsheets, over the schedules, and over the contracts." He was not merely asking for a job, he was demanding a radical, permanent cultural revolution, weaponizing the shame of her public mockery into an unbreakable institutional safeguard against future arrogance. Clara considered the demand for a long moment. He was rejecting the ultimate symbols of corporate success, the corner office, the power title, in favor of raw, disruptive authority that protected the company's bottom line through respect for the lowest ranks. It was the best, most ethical deal she had ever been offered. "Done," she stated firmly, grabbing a pen and signing the document immediately. "The EOV is yours, effective immediately. And as of this moment, we are initiating the Dignity of Craft protocol company-wide, ensuring the field input of our line personnel is weighted equally with our design teams in all technical decisions." 2 hours later, Clara walked onto the hangar floor during the lunch rush, and without fanfare or a teleprompter, gave a brief, sincere apology to the assembled crew, publicly praising Ethan's integrity and unparalleled skill. She acknowledged the cultural problem her own arrogance had created. Ethan, having signed the most powerful non-executive contract in the company's history, was already back at work. His hands were covered in oil and carbon dust, his focus fixed on a mundane but critical maintenance check on a smaller cargo jet. He didn't look up for the applause or the congratulations. He had the title he truly wanted, a dependable father and the man who fixed things. The tattoo, quietly hidden beneath his sleeve once more, had fundamentally changed the culture of the entire multi-billion-dollar aviation hangar, ensuring that no one dared to mock the man with the grease-stained hands ever again. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, Leave a comment and subscribe to TT Healing Tales. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.